The invitation arrived on cream cardstock with gilt edges, my sister's monogram embossed at the top. Chrissy and Lawrence Pemberton request the pleasure of your company. A dinner party. 8 guests, black tie optional. I held it up to the light from my apartment window and watched the expensive paper glow translucent, revealing the watermark of some European stationer that probably charged more per sheet than I spent on groceries in a week. I knew what it meant. It meant Chrissy had something to prove again. I RSVP'd yes, because family is family, and because some battles you walk into knowing exactly what's waiting. My sister had married into the kind of money that comes with hyphens. Old money, careful money, the sort that whispers rather than shouts. Lawrence Pemberton Harcourt, he used both names, had inherited a portfolio of commercial properties across New England, and the casual confidence of someone who'd never once worried about a paycheck. They lived in a restored brownstone on Beacon Hill, the kind with original molding and a view of the common, the kind featured in architectural magazines with titles like Classical Revival in the Heart of Boston. I lived in a 1-bedroom in Arlington with IKEA furniture and a kitchen window that looked directly into my neighbor's kitchen window. The gap between us hadn't always been quite so wide. Growing up in Worcester, we'd shared a room until I was 12, fought over the bathroom mirror, stolen each other's clothes. Our parents had owned a hardware store, nothing fancy, but steady. When they died in a house fire when I was 23 and Chrissy was 26, we'd inherited exactly $47,000 after the mortgage was paid off and debts settled. We'd split it down the middle. I'd used my half to pay off my remaining college loans. I'd been ROTC, so most of it was covered, but there were gaps. With the debt cleared, I'd gone into my Navy career unencumbered, ready to focus on the work. Chrissy had used her half as seed money for an art gallery in Cambridge. It had failed within 18 months. She'd met Lawrence at the closing auction, where he'd bought the last 3 paintings at asking price out of what he later called sympathy for young entrepreneurs. 6 months after that, they were engaged. That was 17 years ago. In that time, Chrissy had renovated 4 homes, joined 3 boards, and perfected the art of the strategic dinner party. I'd made captain, served as naval attaché to France for 3 years, and learned to keep my career details deliberately vague at family gatherings. It was easier that way, cleaner. The dinner party was scheduled for Saturday at 7 p.m. I arrived at 7:15, deliberately late, because arriving on time to Chrissy's events meant getting cornered into helping with last-minute preparations, while she made pointed comments about my inability to, quote, anticipate needs. Lawrence opened the door, resplendent in a velvet dinner jacket that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Tony, so glad you could make it." He air-kissed both my cheeks, the European affectation he'd picked up from somewhere. Love the dress. Very practical. It was a simple black sheath from Ann Taylor, 3 years old, perfectly appropriate. But in Chrissy's world, practical was code for trying your best with limited resources. "Thanks, Lawrence. You look very velvet." He missed the edge in my tone. He always did. The brownstone's interior was exactly what you'd expect. Exposed brick, restored hardwood floors, carefully curated art that managed to look both expensive and deliberately understated. The dining room table could seat 12, but was set for 8, each place setting featuring china I recognized from Chrissy's wedding registry, Hermes, the Shane Doncraw pattern, roughly $400 per plate. The other guests were already assembled in the living room, cocktails in hand. I recognized most of them from previous dinners. Reginald and Vivian Ashford, venture capitalists who spent winters in Aspen. Bethany Cross, a boutique lawyer who specialized in estate planning for the wealthy. And 2 faces I didn't know. A distinguished older couple, impeccably dressed, emanating the quiet authority of old military bearing. "Everyone, you remember my sister Tony?" Chrissy announced, her smile bright and sharp as cut glass. "She's in town between assignments, still with the Navy, doing her thing." Her thing was how Chrissy referred to my 24-year career, as if I'd been pursuing an extended hobby rather than serving my country at increasingly senior levels. How fascinating, Vivian Ashford murmured in the tone people use when they mean the exact opposite. Still in the service at your age, that's quite dedicated. I was 44. In the Navy, I was hitting my prime command years. In Chrissy's social circle, I was apparently overstaying my welcome at a job I should have outgrown by 30. Someone has to do it, I said pleasantly. The older couple I didn't recognize stepped forward. The man extended his hand. Admiral James Kensington, retired. This is my wife, Patricia. We're old friends of Lawrence's parents. I shook his hand, noting the firm grip, the direct eye contact. Naval Academy, if I had to guess. Probably surface warfare. There was something familiar about his face, but I couldn't place it. Tony Easton, pleasure to meet you, sir. His eyes flickered with something. Recognition? Curiosity? But Chrissy was already herding us toward the dining room, her voice pitched to carry over the general conversation. Please, everyone, let's sit. Dinner is ready, and I have a wonderful wine pairing planned. The table was a masterpiece of careful staging. Place cards directed us to our seats. I was positioned between Reginald Ashford and Bethany Cross, safely in the middle where I could be observed but not central to conversation. Chrissy took the head of the table opposite Lawrence, the dual monarchs of their small kingdom. Before we begin, Lawrence announced, standing with a wine bottle in hand, I want to introduce tonight's wine selection. I've been building my cellar for the past 5 years, and I'm particularly excited about what we'll be drinking. He began with a Sancerre for the first course, making a show of examining the label, discussing terroir and vintage years with the kind of casual expertise that comes from having both money and time to develop such knowledge. This is from a small producer in the Loire Valley, he explained, pouring for Reginald first. Only 3,000 cases produced annually. I had to pull some strings to acquire a case. He worked his way around the table, providing each guest with a small lecture about the wine as he poured. When he reached me, he paused, set down the bottle he'd been using, and picked up a different one from the sideboard. This is more your speed, he said, his smile kind, patronizing. From the grocery store, still French though. He poured a generous glass of something that had probably cost $12.99. Chrissy touched his arm, her voice soft but carrying. She won't know the difference anyway. The other guests pretended not to notice, suddenly very interested in their bread plates and butter knives. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt eternal. That particular vacuum of social embarrassment where everyone agrees to collectively ignore something mortifying. I picked up my glass of grocery store wine and took a sip. It wasn't bad, actually. Decent Burgundy, probably. A perfectly acceptable wine that happened to lack the pedigree Lawrence valued. Lovely, I said quietly. Dinner proceeded through its carefully choreographed courses. Oysters with mignonette sauce, discussing Reginald's latest investment in a tech startup. Duck breast with cherry gastrique, debating the merits of private versus public schools for children neither Chrissy nor Lawrence had. Cheese course, examining the relative qualities of Vermont versus French cheesemaking. I ate, smiled, responded when directly addressed. I'd learned long ago how to be present without being visible, how to observe without drawing attention. It was a skill I developed over years of diplomatic functions, where sometimes the most important thing you could do was listen and absorb. Admiral Kensington was watching me, I noticed, not obviously, but with the occasional glance that suggested he was working through something in his mind, some puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Bethany Cross, 3 glasses deep into Lawrence's expensive Sancerre, turned to me with the kind of aggressive friendliness alcohol produces. So Tony, what exactly do you do in the Navy? Chrissy's always so vague about it. I work in international relations, I said. Liaison roles, mostly. Oh, like a secretary, Vivian Ashford brightened. That makes sense. Someone has to keep the paperwork organized. Chrissy laughed, quick and nervous. Something like that. Tony's very good at administrative tasks. Always has been. She's the organized one in the family. Lawrence was opening another bottle now, a Bordeaux for the main course. Being organized is underrated, he said generously. The military needs good support staff. Where would the brass be without their secretaries? I took another sip of my grocery store wine and said nothing. The conversation moved on. Real estate prices in the South End? the difficulties of finding reliable contractors, the superiority of European vacations over domestic travel. I let it wash over me, thinking about the last diplomatic reception I'd attended in Paris, standing in a 17th century chateau with the French defense minister, discussing naval cooperation in the Mediterranean, while waiters circulated with champagne that cost more per bottle than Lawrence's entire wine cellar. I thought about the 3 years I'd lived in Provence, in a villa provided by the embassy, learning the wine country like I'd grown up there, attending tastings at chateaux where my host families had been making wine since before America was a country. I thought about the language skills I'd developed, the relationships I'd built, the delicate work of maintaining allied relationships while navigating the complex waters of international military cooperation. But I said nothing, because that's what you do when you're undercover in your own family. You let them believe what they need to believe. More wine, Tony? Lawrence stood with my bottle, the cheap one, hovering over my glass. I'm fine, thank you. You sure? There's plenty more where this came from. Costco had a sale. Gentle laughter around the table, all very civilized, all very cruel in its civility. Admiral Kensington set down his fork with a definitive click against China. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that makes people stop mid-sentence. I'm sorry, but I have to ask. Captain Easton, is it? Navy? The table went quiet. Yes, sir, I said. I thought I recognized you. Your photograph crossed my desk several times during my tenure as DCNO for international programs. You were naval attaché to France, weren't you? Paris Embassy? The temperature in the room changed. Yes, sir, 3 years, 2019 to 2022. Chrissy's fork clattered to her plate. Attaché? What's an attaché? Admiral Kensington looked at her with barely concealed astonishment. Your sister was the senior U.S. naval officer assigned to the American Embassy in France. She was responsible for managing all naval aspects of our bilateral relationship with one of our most important allies. It's a captain-level billet, highly competitive, usually a stepping stone to major command. Lawrence had gone very still, the bottle of cheap wine forgotten in his hand. Captain? Reginald Ashford's voice cracked slightly. What rank is that exactly? 06, Admiral Kensington said crisply, same as a full colonel in the other services. Selection rate for captain is less than half of 1%. Selection for the Paris attaché position is even more competitive. It requires not only exceptional operational record, but also diplomatic skills, language fluency, and the ability to navigate complex international relationships. Vivian Ashford was staring at me like I'd materialized from another dimension. The Admiral continued, his tone warming slightly as he addressed me directly. Captain Easton lived in Provence for 3 years as naval attaché. She probably knows more about wine than all of us combined. French wine, specifically, which is rather the gold standard, wouldn't you say? The silence was absolute. I met Chrissy's eyes across the table, watched the mathematics working themselves out behind her expression, the calculations of rank and responsibility, the implications of everything she'd assumed and everything she'd been wrong about. You lived in Provence, Bethany Cross said slowly, for 3 years. In an embassy villa, Admiral Kensington added, because apparently he'd decided to thoroughly demolish every assumption in the room. Standard attaché housing. Quite nice, as I recall. 17th century farmhouse, fully restored. The French take care of their allied liaison officers. Lawrence looked down at the bottle of grocery store wine in his hand like it had personally betrayed him. Why didn't you say anything? Chrissy's voice was barely a whisper. I took a sip of my wine, the cheap wine, the grocery store wine, the wine that was more my speed, and set the glass down carefully. You never asked, I said simply. You told me I was a secretary. You told me I worked in administration. You assumed I couldn't tell good wine from bad, that I lived some small, limited life. And I let you believe it, because it was easier than explaining, and because, honestly, I didn't think you'd understand if I tried. Admiral Kensington cleared his throat. Captain, I should tell you, I recommended you for your current position. Deputy Director for European Affairs at OPNAV. The selection board was unanimous. Your work in Paris was exemplary. Thank you, sir, I appreciate that. Reginald Ashford made a strangled noise. OPNAV? That's Pentagon, isn't it? Navy headquarters, the admiral confirmed. Captain Easton helps shape U.S. naval strategy for the entire European theater. It's a significant position. Vivian's hand had gone to her throat, her expensive necklace suddenly looking like a choker. But you said you work in liaison. I do, at a strategic level. Liaising with allied naval forces, coordinating exercises, managing relationships with NATO partners, that sort of thing. The color had drained from Chrissy's face. The apartment in Arlington, you said you had to watch your budget. I do watch my budget, military discipline stays with you. Just because I can afford something doesn't mean I need to spend money on it. The apartment meets my needs. Your salary, Lawrence couldn't seem to finish the sentence. 06, with 24 years of service, plus DC locality pay and housing allowance, Admiral Kensington supplied helpfully. She's making approximately $165,000 base, plus benefits and allowances. Total compensation probably pushes $200,000. The number hung in the air like a grenade. Bethany Cross had her phone out, fingers moving frantically across the screen. Naval attaché to France, she muttered. Strategic policy at the Pentagon. Jesus Christ, there are news articles. There's a photo of you with the French president. That was the Bastille Day reception in 2021. I confirmed. Nice evening. The Élysée has excellent wine. Lawrence's hand trembled as he set down the bottle. Red wine sloshed slightly, threatening to spill on the pristine white tablecloth. I compared you to a secretary, Chrissy said, her voice hollow. I told people you were good at filing. You did, I agreed, multiple times. Christmas 2022, Thanksgiving 2023, your birthday party last June. It became something of a running joke. Why didn't you correct me? I considered the question, looking at my sister across the expanse of her perfect table, her perfect dinner party now in ruins around her. Because you needed me to be less than you, I said quietly. You needed to win something, anything after the gallery failed. After Lawrence's money solved all your problems but couldn't solve the fundamental question of what you'd accomplished on your own. You needed me to be small so you could feel big. The truth of it landed like a physical blow. Chrissy's eyes filled with tears. And I let you, I continued, because you're my sister, and because at the end of the day your opinion of me doesn't change what I do or who I am. I've negotiated arms sales with the French Navy. I've managed diplomatic incidents that could have damaged Allied relationships. I've briefed members of Congress on European security issues. Whether or not you knew about it was irrelevant to the work. Admiral Kensington raised his glass. The good wine, the expensive Sancerre that I hadn't been offered. To Captain Easton, he said firmly, and to service above self. Patricia Kensington, who'd been silent throughout dinner, raised her glass as well. To service, she echoed. The other guests scrambled to raise their glasses, the motion awkward and uncertain. Chrissy lifted hers with a hand that shook visibly. Lawrence managed to get his halfway up before seeming to forget what he was doing. I raised my glass of grocery store wine, which in the end was perfectly good wine, just not wine that screamed its pedigree, and nodded acknowledgement. Thank you, sir. The dinner limped through dessert. A tart tatin that Chrissy had probably spent hours perfecting, now eaten in near silence, broken only by stilted attempts at conversation that died as quickly as they began. When coffee was served, I excused myself, claiming an early morning meeting. It was true. I had a video conference with EUCOM at 7 a.m. about Black Sea operations. Admiral Kensington walked me to the door while the others remained frozen in the dining room, caught in the amber of their shattered assumptions. That was well done, Captain, he said quietly. Not easy, being underestimated by the people who should know you best. It had become a habit, sir. Probably past time to break it. For what it's worth, your work in Paris was some of the finest diplomatic liaison work I've seen in 40 years of service. The French still ask about you. That's kind of you to say. He studied me for a moment, then smiled. Lawrence is going to spend the rest of the evening Googling your career and realizing exactly how foolish he looked. Chrissy's going to have a harder time with it. Pride's a difficult thing to swallow, But sometimes families need the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Yes, sir. I stepped out into the Boston night, the air crisp with the promise of fall. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of shocked conversation resuming, voices rising in questions and disbelief. My phone buzzed. A text from a colleague at the Pentagon, brief moved to 0630. Admiral wants updated assessment on French carrier availability. I typed back, acknowledged, will be ready. The T station was 3 blocks away. I'd take the Green Line to Park Street, transfer to Red, be home in 40 minutes. Tomorrow I'd wake at 5 a.m., go for my morning run, and be at my desk by 6:15, ready to help shape American naval policy for one of the world's most critical regions. And Chrissy would wake up in her beautiful brownstone, pour coffee from her expensive Italian machine, and try to figure out how she'd spent 17 years completely misunderstanding her own sister. I thought about calling her, maybe starting the conversation that should have happened years ago, but not tonight. Tonight, we both needed to sit with what had been revealed. The T platform was nearly empty, just a few other late-night travelers scattered along its length. I stood near the edge, watching for the headlight of the approaching train, and realized I was smiling. Not because I'd won something, or because I'd embarrassed Chrissy in front of her friends, but because I didn't have to hide anymore, at least not from my family. The truth, it turned out, was its own kind of freedom. The train arrived in a rush of light and sound. I stepped aboard, found a seat, and watched the dark tunnel walls flash past as we hurtled through the underground city. Somewhere above me, Chrissy was probably still sitting at her dining room table, staring at the empty chair where I'd been sitting, trying to reconcile 17 years of assumptions with the reality of who I actually was. I pulled out my phone and drafted a text. "Thank you for dinner. We should talk soon. Really talk." I stared at it for 3 stops, then pressed send. The response came almost immediately. "Yes, please, I'm so sorry." I typed back, "I know, we'll figure it out." And we would, eventually. Because that's what families do. They hurt each other, misunderstand each other, underestimate each other. And then, if they're lucky and willing to do the work, they find their way back to the truth. The train carried me home through the darkness, and I thought about the Provence via, the diplomatic receptions, the years of work that had shaped me into someone my own sister hadn't recognized. But mostly, I thought about the look on Lawrence's face when he realized he'd been serving me grocery store wine while I'd been the most qualified person at his table to judge every bottle in his cellar. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or cruel. Sometimes it's just the truth, arriving exactly when it needs to, delivered by a retired admiral who happened to know your real story. I got off at Alewife, walked to my modest apartment building, climbed the 3 flights to my 1-bedroom with its IKEA furniture and kitchen window view of another kitchen window. Home. Small, simple, perfectly adequate for a woman who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I poured myself a glass of water, not wine, and stood at that kitchen window, looking out at Boston's sprawling suburbs stretching into the darkness. Tomorrow I'd help shape strategy for one of the world's most powerful naval forces. But tonight, I was just a woman in a modest apartment, finally free of the weight of her family's assumptions.